The aim for these roundtables is to have a cross-disciplinary dialogue and to really reflect on some of the key hot topics that are shaping academic discussions and teaching-related discussions overall. And so today we have a really exciting set of speakers, and I will introduce them briefly as we go through. Considering that the time we have 6 key speakers today, all from the Open University, and they will be reflecting from their very disciplinary positions as to their contributions and the work that they've done around decolonisation. So without any sort of delay, and we have, apologies, the other one is where we've been having, particularly at the Open University, we've been having a whole set of conversations and research and teaching related discussions around what it means to decolonise, but also what is the decolonisation of research as it's undertaken. And so the aim for these 6 speakers is to really think around the range that we have of what is treated and what has been undertaken as decolonisation. So the way we are organising the discussion today, we'll have in a way 3 parts. The first part is where the speakers will reflect on and tell us a bit about the work that they've done and what way they've considered that work, in what way they've achieved decolonisation, or what they would consider the politics of decolonisation as it relates to their respective projects. The second part will be looking at what it means for teaching and research and how has that impacted the teaching and research of the various speakers who are here. And then lastly, we'll have a Q&A session. And so to start us off with the first discussion is Jasper Singh from the Open University. Everyone, because we have such a timeline, if everyone could stick to about 5 to 6 minutes per speaker, and I'll introduce people as they come in as we move forward. So if you could start with Jasper, please.
Thanks. Peace, everyone. My name is Jasper. Thank you, Gunjan. Thanks to all the organizers for putting this roundtable together. I think it's a really important opportunity for us to reflect on decolonisation and progress. First off, I just want to give thanks and praises to my ancestors who lived across the Eurasian continent and have greatly suffered on all sides of my family from coloniality, from particularly British and German colonialism. I'm a lecturer in applied linguistics and English language, and I work at the OU. I've been working at the OU since June 2021, 1 year after the murder of George Floyd, which was a watershed moment in the discourse around decolonisation in the global north. Every institution now wanted to decolonise everything. So when I spoke about decolonisation in my job interview, I had 6 people nodding and raising their eyebrows excitingly and enthusiastically. So that was a good idea, I guess, of mine to bring that in. And subsequently, when I started my job, especially in module production, I'm part of a module or part of several module teams, and we are producing new modules in linguistics for our new MA. I was frequently consulted as the decolonisation expert. I was even invited to give a presentation about how we could decolonise our curriculum. And again, I had very empathetic and very reflective listeners who took everything on board that I said, and who would reflect very critically on issues of white supremacy and structural racism in their teaching. In a very honest manner. And I will talk about maybe some of these points later in the second round, in response to the second questions, and talk a bit about the limitations of decolonising the curriculum. But in sum, I had a very positive experiences at the OU when it comes to decolonising the curriculum. However, this was completely different in relation to my activist work after October the 8th, 2028, which I equally see as a decolonial struggle. So when it comes to decolonising Palestine, I met, on the whole at least, with either silence by my colleagues or with hostility and accusations, false accusations of anti-Semitism. However, I did find a few people, a small number of people who were willing to speak up for Palestine with me and link this activist work to questions of decolonization. So we formed the Open University Palestine Solidarity Group, of which some of you are part. Thank you for that. And we hold weekly drop-in sessions every Wednesday from 10 to 10:30, where we just share experiences. And these sessions have been incredibly powerful. Every Wednesday we meet and we just talk straight from our chest, and speak about Palestine and our feelings around this and the structural violence that surrounds this whole issue. We have also recently successfully submitted a bid to the OSC, the Open Societal Challenges, the flagship sort of internal funding scheme of the OU. And we were successful with a bid on trying to understand the Palestine exception. And what we mean by that is we try to understand why the OU and in fact other universities around in the global north seem to want to decolonize everything except for Palestine. And this is what we are trying to do now. And yeah, that's what I would like to sort of just bring to your attention, that I guess there is an open ear, if we want to use that metaphor, for decolonization efforts across the OU, but not when it comes to Palestine and possibly to other related issues. Thanks for now.
Thank you so very much, Paul, and thank you so much for sticking to the time. Really appreciate that. Next, we have Rod Earl from Youth Justice, and yes, Rod.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to this panel. Just for me, it just affirms sort of how many people there are in the OU who I should know about but don't know about. And in preparing for this, it's been really helpful to discover some of your work. I joined the School of Health and Social Care, as it was then, as a youth justice lecturer in 2008. And I've been in the part of the school ever since. But I've had a kind of rather zigzag career. Slipping into academia by the back door, as it were, after working without a PhD, I should say, after working with young people in trouble with the law for about 15 years in Lambeth, South London. And I guess, towards the end of that 15 years, I did a master's degree in criminology that helped me get a job in 2000, evaluating some of New Labour's reforms of the youth justice system, which I think just about sort of qualified me for the job that I was asked to do at the Open University. But 2008, you might remember, was the greatest crisis in the global financial system since the beginning of the 20th century almost, and one of the casualties of that was New Labour's ambition to build a professional youth justice system, and kind of incidentally the professional qualifications that I was working on in health and social care, they were gradually wound down as the youth justice system itself sort of shrank in size and ambition. But before the Open University, before I joined the Open University, I was involved in a research project that really has propelled my sort of academic fortunes ever since, and that forms the basis of the work I do now on race and racism and decolonial perspectives, sort of in and around criminology. Because working with Coretta Phillips from the LSE, I spent 2 years on an ethnography of men's imprisonment, looking at questions of race and ethnicity and social relations in 2 men's prisons in southeast of England. And that was a kind of revelation for 2 reasons. First was that it involved working closely with a black mixed race woman on issues of racialization, ethnic identification and social relations. And there were just sort of 2 of us on the project, and so my being white and a man and her being a woman and mixed race became really central to the work that we've been doing ever since, mainly around criminology and criminology's sort of problem with race, racism, and by implication and inferences were coloniality. The second reason, though, that the prison ethnography was significant to my academic interests is that it involved a sort of slightly unsettling, but in the end, I think quite productive return to prison for me, because I served a short prison sentence in 1982 for incitement to arson, and it's a rather sort of long story I won't go into, but a fanzine I'd printed had included a recipe for a Molotov cocktail, and it was kind of innocent rhetoric, but when the fanzine hit the street, it coincided with the Brixton insurrection in 1981, and the police sort of saw a conspiracy where really there was nothing but anger and confusion. And so, to cut a long story short, my two experiences of prison have sort of led to a development of something called convict criminology, where I try and align my work with other, mainly with other sort of academics who've got that kind of double exposure to imprisonment, and they're drawing in some ways on Spivak's ideas around sort of subaltern studies, can the prisoner speak, as it were. So that's the sort of work that I've been doing in criminology. But increasingly, for me, that's involved sort of engaging with the dynamics of whiteness, and particularly the ways in which it involves a kind of resistance within amongst white people for a sort of disengagement from and a disinterest in issues to do with race and coloniality. So really, that's the sort of stuff I'm trying to work on now, which connects slightly remotely in some ways with the work that I do, which I'll talk about in the sort of second section on the qualifications and the sort of the modules that we produce in health and social care, which is for people who are studying for social work degrees or in nursing or other aspects of health and social care. So that's sort of kind of where I'm coming from. Perhaps I hope that helps a little bit in contextualizing whatever contributions I can make here. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for that, Rod. And again, thank you for sticking to the time. I really appreciate it. Our third speaker is Geetha Reddy from psychology. Geetha, if I could have you.
Thank you, Gunjan. It was really lovely to hear about Rod's and Jaspal's work. Jaspal and I have met briefly, but I've never met Rod before, so it's really nice to be connected to other folks who are thinking through with this as well. And thanks for this space. I am a lecturer at the School of Psychology and Counseling. I joined the OU in July 2022, so I've just about started my third year at the OU. And like Jaspal, I did bring up decolonisation at my interview because it was the work that I was doing before coming to the OU. I was in another institution and part of a working group decolonising the psychology curriculum there, and trying to see at which levels we need to do this sort of work, and this work can be done. So I primarily work within psychology, but I avoid disciplinary decadence, so I work outside of psychological sciences as well to understand how people make sense of colonization, multiculturalism, and migration. So this is primarily my area of work. So it's not only a sort of additional work that I'm doing, additional labor that I'm doing within the university, but it's also very much the core of my research projects. My research generally just takes an intersectional perspective on identities, and I try to highlight the power structures that influence an individual's psychology. And I work primarily with communities in and from Malaysia, Singapore, and South Africa. So as a result of this focus, I've had to understand the various layers of powers that are embedded within these different contexts that I'm working in. And this meant reviewing how the various forms of colonization, different types of colonization, but also different colonial powers, the British, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the Japanese in the case of Malaysia and Singapore. And that's been my preoccupation with my research for the last 10 years. Yeah, 12 years. Beyond my own research project, I find myself a part of a global movement that is questioning and disrupting these Western psychological understandings of our social world. So we know that very early on, the foundation of psychology was trying to use calipers to measure brains of people and to decide, whether these people are intelligent or not. And so that's the very foundation of the discipline is built on this violent practice. And so this has carried through in our theorizations, in the way we conceptualize what is emotion, what is the psyche of the human, and who is therefore human as well. So that there's so much coloniality embedded within the discipline itself. And during my PhD, I was trying to understand what are these various layers. So I've written about knowledge production within the psychological sciences with my colleagues. I've also co-edited 3 special issues on decolonial approaches in and of psychology with colleagues from South Africa, Professor Kopano Rotele, Professor Shanaz Safla, and a colleague based in North America, Professor Glenn Adams. So I've been doing quite a bit of theoretical work trying to tease apart these various layers that are embedded within the discipline of psychology and the psychological sciences. But if you want to see about its application of theory, I'm currently a principal investigator of a project trying to understand coloniality and precarity as it manifests amongst urban, poor, resilient Malaysian Indian women. So from moving from the theoretical aspects, I'm also trying to look at a bottom-up understanding of what coloniality is and how this continues to engender precarity. These principles and these theorizations that I've understood from Latin American scholars, from African scholars and Asian scholars, I then apply to editorial work that I've been doing with the Journal of Social and Political Psychology, the South African Journal of Psychology, and the British Journal of Social Psychology. So I try to infuse these principles into these editorial practices as well, pushing back where I can on slow scholarship and trying to get people to reckon with the coloniality in these research methods that they are writing about and they are practicing. And at a more global level, we're trying to disrupt the way racism and coloniality manifest in editorial and reviewers' practices. So working with different organizations such as the British Psychological Society, the American Psychological Association, and creating guidelines for other reviewers and editors who perhaps don't have these practices nailed down yet and are trying to evolve their editorial practices. Within the OU, I have to say, workload has been a bit challenging for us to try to pull this out. When people talk about going into module production, there are very strict days that we have this number of days to look at this aspect, this chapter that needs to be written or this VLE that needs to be written. And so our workloads are so tightly organized that trying to say we actually need an education or we need to run a working group or a program where we need to try to see if we can come onto somewhat of a same page when we are doing these modules, creating these modules has been challenging, I have to say. It's not to say that the desire is not there. Of course, like Jaspal has mentioned, there is a strong openness. It's well received. People are like, yes, we do understand this, but how do we then put that into the workload? How do we then try to do this with any give it the importance that it needs? That has been definitely a challenge, and I think I'm not alone in this experiencing this challenge. I will leave it at that, and then I will leave for questions and also the second part of the section. Thank you, Gunjan.
Great, thank you so very much, Geetha. Yeah, I think all the conversations are sort of building onto each other and some of the points being, hopefully we can pick some of these things out as we move forward. Next we have Folsayo Olalere from Design.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm Folsayo Olalere, and I'm lecturer in design at the STEM faculty. I'm part of the production team working on our new qualification design, Bachelor of Design, and I joined the OU a year and a month ago, sometime September last year. So I'm still quite new to the OU. But in terms of decolonization, well, it's been something I've been working on, I guess, over the last 10 years. It's quite exciting to see that the whole discussion is coming up, in the Western world. I'm surprised it took them so long. So, anyways, in terms of decolonization and my engagement, it's been quite interesting. I think my drive and interest actually was centered around perhaps maybe my journey over the years. It's interesting to see Gita mention Malaysia and South Africa, which I also will be mentioning just now. I did my PhD in Malaysia, finished sometimes 2016. After that, I moved to South Africa, where I was there just until last year before joining the OU. So if you have maybe a little bit of historical understanding of what decolonization is and perhaps what actually was the history around it, it's difficult to talk about the history without mentioning South Africa. In fact, by the time I moved to South Africa was just exactly the time when there's this Fees Must Fall protest, which actually ignited the whole discussion around decolonization. I remember one of the days when I just moved to South Africa. I couldn't go to the campus because, well, the protest is really tense and we're all just sitting at home. And then I just managed that evening to walk down to the campus gate, and I saw students, carrying placards and all that. And one of the students was carrying that decolonized education in South Africa. Quite exciting, and seeing that as for the first time, like, okay, decolonized education, what exactly does that mean? So I managed to walk up to the student and asked, what do you mean by decolonizing education? And then the student asked me, where did you see that? I said, that's what you're holding. So you discover that the whole idea around decolonization and people actually, talking about it and all that, don't really understand what it means. And even up to now, a lot of people talk about decolonization, and it's so difficult when you talk about what exactly are you talking about. They can't even explain what it means, and there's a lot of controversy around the whole idea. And in fact, a few months ago, somebody told me, decolonization is just a buzzword. What are you even talking about? So that is one of the things that actually drove me to kind of maybe engaging in it. What exactly does it mean, and what exactly the understanding of it itself? And just a couple of weeks ago, one of my book chapter was published. The book was completely centered around curriculum design and decolonization. So there, my chapter looked into what exactly, looking at the theoretical understanding of decolonization from different perspectives. What are people saying around it? I remember then in South Africa, then some would say, no, let's start using our whole native language to teach. Yeah, that's decolonization. And then I asked them, yeah, how do you use a native language? What exactly do you even mean by native language in a class or in a country where we have almost like 11 languages? And I've been in classrooms where various students don't even understand their own, various languages. So what is that language that we're going to use? There's so many complexity around it. And I think it's time we start to kind of understand what exactly we're even talking about before we even start saying, yeah, I'm decolonizing. And that's exactly where my own standpoint is, trying to understand what exactly it is. And when we now understand it, then we can see how we can apply it, or we can integrate it into our teaching, into our curriculum design and all that. So me being part of the production team, I've been trying to kind of contribute within that aspect, also bringing colleagues into, the understanding of how do we kind of pay conscious attention to this. Because at the end of the day, we just need to be more conscious about it. It must be intentional. When we talk about decolonization, it's not something that will just happen like unconsciously. We just need to be more conscious about it and then implement it in whatever we're doing. So that's part of the things I've been contributing. And also in terms of research, over more than 10 years, I'm in design, but I've been kind of cross-disciplinary and in terms of my research. And one of my interests has been on promoting indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage. We've used that like kind of documenting digital documentation of cultural heritage? How do we kind of transform or kind of bring indigenous knowledge to play within the community and even in whatever we're designing? So how do we ensure that that fit into the cultural space in which we're designing? Because at the end of the day, sometimes we talk about design, people look at it as a universal kind of approach. Yeah, we design, one shoe fit all, and then we throw it to everybody. It must work for everybody. So the cultural aspect of it, how does it come to play when we talk about design? So that has been my own focus. And perhaps maybe later when we discuss, I can share some of the research I recently completed, where with some teams where we're documenting culinary heritage of Ghanaian, indigenous Ghanaian community, where we looked at it from indigenous standpoint, and not just simply documenting it and then telling their stories for them, but then kind of capacitating them to be able to document it themselves and tell their own story. And whatever is documented, they curate it, and they give us, this is how we want our story to be. This is how we want to tell our story. This is how we want to be represented, and all that. So that to me is decolonization. It's not just about somebody coming from somewhere, just stay with them for a couple of days and then just interview them, and then write something and then say, this is the community. So decolonization goes deeper than that, and even in curriculum, it's not just about we bring in some textbook from other people, some other different place, and then including it in our curriculum. It goes beyond that. We need to engage it. How are we interrogating those knowledges? How are we actually bringing them to play within our curriculum? That to me is decolonization. So I talk too much. Thank you. We talk later.
Thank you so very much for that. Our next speaker is Rob Farrow from Institute of Education Technology. Rob.
Hi there, and it's a pleasure to speak with you all today, and thank you for the invitation. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Institute of Educational Technology, and I've been with the Open University since 2009. When I joined the Open University, I was in the final stages of my PhD in philosophy. And in my disciplinary background, I'm very much identifying with the critical tradition and wrote my PhD on critical theory. But since I've been working at the Open University, I've been working primarily in educational technology research, and specifically with a focus on open education since about 2011, 2012, something like that. And in the course of that work, I've been involved in a lot of different research projects in a lot of different countries around open education, often around open educational resources specifically. And this is an area where a lot of people see potential for decolonising the curriculum, for instance. But also, it's less common now, but people have also described this as a form of colonialism, right? Because you're giving out the open resources, but essentially they're coded Western and Northern. And people are more likely to adopt them because they're free and so on. That's less the case now. And for me, the interesting part around this is more around kind of the relationship between power and knowledge reproduction. I'll come back to that in just a second. Some of my main roles at the moment, I'm the co-editor of the Journal of Interactive Media and Education, and I'm the co-director of a global network of support for doctoral students working in the field of open education called GoGN, Global OER Graduate Network. And this network is about 11 years old now. We've got nearly 400 members who are either postdoctoral researchers or they are currently doing a doctorate in the field of open education. And we do various things to try and support people in the Global South as part of that. Around a third of our members are from the Global South or they live in the Global South currently. And we run webinars to try and amplify people's work. We pay for people to attend conferences and workshops and that kind of thing. And so part of what we do is sort of platforming those researchers. I don't tend to think of what we're doing as decolonisation, right? I don't really use that language for what we do. We tend to speak in terms of equity, diversity and inclusion. And I'll just give you a link in the chat to our EDI project. I don't lead this work myself, but I'm involved in it. And so we have a whole strand of work which is based around trying to listen to people in different countries and in different contexts and tried to understand what would best support them, what would inclusion look like to them, rather than kind of how going in with a predetermined idea around what that looks like. Where I have kind of engaged with decolonisation more directly is in a research paper, which I'll just put a link in the chat to. And here, because there's a rhetoric around with open education and decolonisation, and really the idea of this paper was to say, okay, let's look back at some of these EdTech projects. A lot of the time, the focus wasn't even necessarily on decolonisation as such, but it's part of the kind of framework, if you like, around open education and what we're sort of, supposed to be doing. And so we tried to go back and look and assess, what was going on there in terms of decolonisation. What was the lasting effect of this? And I would agree with some of the previous comments around, you have these kind of short-term interactions, especially with research projects or teaching implementations. They rarely last more than 2 or 3 years. And it's like, okay, job done. We've decolonised this. No, right? And also, I would say that decolonisation itself, like there's a risk of sort of, I guess, sort of the kind of virtue signalling almost, where you say, yes, we're aligning ourselves with these progressive things, we're decolonising and so on. But when you look at it, what's actually happening? What's really happening? What's changing as a result of this? Not much, but you can tell a good story around it, right? And you can talk about these lofty ambitions and this kind of thing. And so I think it's really important to maintain a critical perspective on this stuff, which I don't think would be a surprise to most people. And I think there's a lot of work to be done to try and understand, as the previous speaker said, what do we really mean by this, right? Is decolonisation a kind of destination that we can get to? Is it more like a kind of regulative ideal? Is it something on the horizon which we can never really get to? I think these are interesting questions, but I don't really sort of centralize this in my own work so much as, I'm interested mainly in open education and the different kind of ways in which that pans out. But increasingly, I'm minded to be a bit more proactive with this stuff, and also feel more like I can have a voice. Because some people in this kind of space will say, well, you're a white male from the global north, we've heard enough from your kind, or this kind of stuff. I've heard this in conferences, and I'm not very impressed by it actually. And I feel more like the right approach is dialogic and engaged and trying to build new categories of thought collaboratively, which can help us to move on from some of the things that have held us back in the past. And one thing I would just say that if you do check out the link to the paper that I've shared, the table at the very bottom is the thing that might be of most interest, where what we try to do is to map what the kind of supported open learning approach from the Open University looks like and how that can actually relate in tangible terms to dimensions of decolonisation, specifically being, power and knowledge. And I think that's some, potentially useful conceptual work that other people might find interesting. Thanks.
Great, thank you so very much for that, Rob. Next, we have part of the program, geography.
Hi, I'm a professor of geography and migration at the Open University. Thank you very much for organizing the session. I had given a paper in 1996 saying, and of which the title was Asking the Right Question. And I've always believed that actually we haven't even research questions tend to be broadly hypothetical deductive in its formation. And so we really do not really begin with the categories or the problems that people often have. We start from where we are at, which is kind of understandable. But on the other hand, I wanted to read about it. So when Linda Smith's book came out in 2000, in 1999, I think, 1997, I started reading it and I found it really useful, along with some very helpful anthropology literature at that time. When decolonisation became a big thing later on, I was surprised because I had been thinking about it for more than a decade by then. And I had by then convinced myself that actually decolonisation was not something that we could do. Other people can do it, but not us. We can decolonize only the ground on which we stand. And very often people go off into Africa or other places to do decolonial work. And I didn't believe that we could do that. And I continue to believe that, which led me to the exciting thought of having a big project called Decolonising Education for Peace in Africa. And if you start the slide, this was a £1.5 million project. And I thought it was a Network Plus project, which means that I could give money to people to do the projects that they wanted to do. So that now changed everything. I felt, okay, this is possible for, because they can do their own work. So in the next slide, you'll see what we were trying to do in doing this is to figure out what does actually decolonization mean? I've been quite irritated by some of Mignolo's work and the way in which that's kind of really reduced decolonization for many people into a very happy epistemic endeavor. So what I did was to get this really large grant, which is in slide 3. You can see the countries there, which was a Pan-African, pan-continental approach, and we had 16 projects in 14 countries. And in the 4th slide, you'll see what our approach was, which was recognition, representation, reconciliation, and redistribution. Most importantly, most of 1, 2, and 3 were done by Africans, and only passing over the money and helping to provide some access to education can be done by us. So we were not really able to, so most of it was about actually, let's just take the ODA money and give it to the people, right? Spend it in Africa and let them spend it the way that they want to spend it. And support them in that. Yeah. So lots of facilitation, lots of frictions, but lots of facilitation. And in slide 5, you'll see our approaches, which was locally owned problem identification and methods, community-level actions, context-sensitive solutions, and IP and data stays locally, which means that we actually get really nothing out of this apart from the fact that we facilitated somebody else. So there's always a thing of shifting power by giving up something yourself. And in slide 6, you'll see some of our methodologies, and then I'll just talk you through in the next 4 slides, the 4 things that were essential to it. So in Ghana, in slide 7, you'll see that we were validating pre-colonial knowledges, analysis of what makes pre-colonial peacemaking could look like, such as the masquerade tradition. And we got Africans and African diasporics providing training to each other in the creative economy on how to, and this is one of the masquerades, and they actually had a carnival, and they learned how to produce these. They taught each other. They did whatever they had to do. Right. We did not go there. We did not get involved. So half of it is also not getting involved, really. And then number 8 was using knowledge in new ways. So if we had a storyteller who worked with communities and teachers, and they then went out into communities, and they completely shifted how their own position in society. They got onto the community of elders. We encouraged them to write a book about their methodologies, which they have now done. Then they came from the Kwamakwe to Sierra Leone to present. So we provided a venue for them to present their work in public and to, get whatever that takes. So again, it's all about facilitation. In slide 9, what we talk about is a project in Zambia, where you can see most of the books about conflict, about peace in Africa start with actually violence in Africa rather than peace. So what we did was we worked with community teachers to actually look at peace proverbs, to look at their textbooks and say what could be changed in their textbooks. And they came up with the ideas of what they wanted to change in their textbooks. And then we gave some money to the teaching inspectors to try and institutionalize that in Zambia. And then in slide 10, you'll see some new knowledge in old ways. So they learned how to use, this was another project in Sierra Leone where they learned how to use video editing, and that was provided by Sierra Leonean. And then they went out into the communities and they taught other young people, and they formed a Pan-African network, and they sent out a lot of peace videos before the elections to try and limit conflict and also spot check where there was misinformation on social media. And finally, creating new knowledges connections, which is where they tried to, for instance, look at why does curriculum stop at the borders, right? When actually African borders are cross-community. So DRC Congo, the DRC Burundi project tried to think about what the use of poetry to think about the borders, but also to think about curriculum, which stretches across the borders, given that they're sometimes in conflict, but actually there are also lots of communities which stretch across. So what do I think I did decolonization? Probably only in terms of redistribution and facilitation. They did the decolonization. It is not an epistemic endeavor alone, and it is really about shifting power. And that requires loads of time, sustainability, and lots of work, and not to think about it in terms of what you get out of it. And I think that's very difficult for us when we are taught that we have to gain something from our research ourselves. Thanks.